Exzellenz,
Your Excellency, how had Pope Emeritus Benedict been doing towards the very end of his life?
Ist ja eigentlich gegen seine Auffassung sehr alt geworden.
Contrary to what he thought, he lived to a ripe old age. He was convinced that after his resignation, the good Lord would grant him just one more year. No one was probably more surprised than he was to see that this one more year turned out to be quite a few more years. Towards the end, he was physically very weak, very frail, of course, but thanks be to God, his mind was as clear as ever. What was painful for him was to see his voice became quieter and weaker. He had depended his whole life on the use of his voice, and this tool had become lost to him. But his mind was always clear. He was serene, composed, and we who were always around him, who lived with him, could feel that he was on the home stretch, and that this home stretch had an end. And he had this end firmly in sight.
Was he afraid of dying?
Hat nie von Angst gesprochen. Hat immer wieder gesprochen vom Herrn.
He never spoke about fear. He always spoke about the Lord, of his hope that when he would finally stand before him, he would show him mildness and mercy, knowing, of course, about his weaknesses and his sins, his life. But, as St. John said, God is greater than our heart.
Gott ist größer auch als unser Herz.
You spent many years by his side. What were the key moments for you?
Ja, es hat begonnen als Mitarbeiter in der Glaubenskongregation, als Präfekt war in einer.
Well, for me, everything started when I became a staff member of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. When he, Cardinal Ratzinger, was the prefect. I then became the secretary. That was supposed to last a few months at most, but in the end it lasted 2 years. Then John Paul II died, and Joseph Ratzinger became Pope Benedict XVI. I spent all those years as secretary by his side, and then, of course, also during his time as Pope Emeritus. He was longer a Pope Emeritus than a reigning pope. What always impressed and even surprised me was his gentleness, how serene and good-tempered he was, even in situations that were very exhausting, very demanding, and at times even very sad from a human point of view. He never lost his composure, he never lost his temper. On the contrary, the more he was challenged, the quieter and poorer in words he became. But this had very good and benevolent effects on those around him.
Aber das hat auf die Umgebung sehr gute und wohlwollende Wirkung gehabt.
He was, however, not at all used to large crowds. Of course, as a professor, he was used to speaking in front of a large, even a very large audience of students. But that was him as a professor speaking to students. Later, as Pope, all these encounters with people from different countries, their joy and enthusiasm, were, of course, a very different experience. He had to get used to it, and it wasn't easy to find the right way. But he didn't let some media coach tell him what to do. He simply and naturally took on the task, and finally, as I can say, grew into it.
Also überhaupt nichts von irgendeinem Mediencoach vorsagen lassen, sondern ganz einfach und ganz natürlich diese Aufgabe übernommen und ist da, so darf ich wohl sagen, also wirklich hereingewachsen.
Die Milde haben Sie angesprochen.
So we were talking about his mildness, how he dealt with those around him. Can you give us an example?
Ich kann mich gut erinnern an eine Begegnung mit einer Reihe.
I remember a meeting with bishops and cardinals during his time as prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The topic was such that things got heated relatively quickly, both in terms of content and also verbal statements. Italian had to be spoken since it was the common language. And I could see that the Italian native speakers were, of course, quicker and stronger, showing even slight spurts of aggression. In his very simple, somewhat quiet manner, he first toned down the aggressive atmosphere. trying to get from tone to content. He simply said, the arguments are either convincing or they are not convincing. The tone can either be disturbing or helpful. I suggest we help each other to take down the tone and strengthen the arguments.
Die Argumente sind überzeugend oder nicht. Der Ton kann störend sein oder hilfreich. Ich bitte, dass wir uns gegenseitig helfen, den Ton herunterzunehmen und die Argumente zu stärken.
Can you tell us more about him as a person? How did he understand the papal office? After all, he was a human being having to deal with that sort of task.
Also das Letzte, was gesucht hat und sich gewünscht hat, war sicherlich mit 78 Jahren Papst zu werden.
Well, surely the last thing he wished for or desired was to become Pope at the age of 78. But he became Pope, he embraced it, he saw it as the will of God, and he took this task on. At the beginning, there was some initial momentary insecurity. TV cameras and photographers were just everywhere. And a private life, a normal life, was no longer possible. But I could feel how he simply put himself in this situation, trusting firmly in the help of God, that he would give him the gifts that he had been lacking and he now needed. Trusting that with his natural gifts, but also with the help of God, he would be able to carry out the office entrusted to him, managing it in such a way that it would indeed be for the benefit of the whole Church and the faithful.
Amt so ausführt und so bewältigt, dass es tatsächlich zum Nutzen der ganzen Kirche und der Gläubigen sein wird.
Sie haben zu Beginn gesagt,
At the beginning, you said that the word, the spoken but also the written word, was his tool, so to say. Which of his writings, his encyclical letters, his books, are important for you personally?
Als Papst hat ja 3 Enzykliken geschrieben, man kam 4. Die vierte
As Pope, he wrote 3 encyclical letters. The 4th was written together with Pope Francis and then also published by Pope Francis, Lumen Fide, on the faith. I must confess that Spe Salvi is the encyclical that has given me personally the most spiritual nourishment.
Geistliche Nahrung gegeben hat und von der ich glaube, dass sie auch.
And I also believe that of all of his important encyclical letters, this one will ultimately win the race. I started reading his work when I was still a student in seminary and in Freiburg. I read all of it. And that, of course, influences one's spiritual growth. I think that one of the things that will remain is certainly the Jesus trilogy. Originally, it was supposed to be only 1 volume. He started it when he was a cardinal, and he finished the first volume as Pope. And he thought that the good Lord would only give him strength enough for the first book. He wanted that, among the writings that were published under his name, besides the official texts he wrote as Pope, and of course his encyclical letters, for example, the Jesus trilogy, his Jesus book in 3 volumes, would be seen as his spiritual and intellectual testament. He started writing it as a cardinal, and then continued as Pope. At the beginning he said, "It's now time for me to finish. Who knows how long my strength will last?"
Und sie reichten und hat beim 2. Band angefangen und so weiter.
His strength did last. He started the 2nd volume and so on. These 3 volumes contain his whole personal being as a priest, a bishop, a cardinal, and a pope, but also all of his theological research, his whole life of prayer, in a form which, thanks be to God, can be easily understood. A form which is written at the highest academic level, but will also, for the faithful, be his lasting personal testimony. And exactly that was the intention. With this book, this form of proclamation of the faith, he wanted to strengthen people in the faith, lead them to faith, and open doors to faith.
Aber auch Türe zum Glauben öffnen.
Und vielleicht für Sie ganz persönlich.
Which of these thoughts will you embrace personally? Which ones have helped you the most?
Welche werden Sie auch mitnehmen?
Also wenn ich auf das Jesusbuch direkt schaue.
When I look at the book on Jesus, the crucial thing is that this book doesn't describe something from the past, this one person, even if he is the Savior, but it talks about the present. Christ lived, but he is still alive. Reading this book helps to make the connection, so to speak, with today, with Christ. I don't just read something that happened. Something happened, yes, but what happened has meaning for me, for everyone who reads it, for my personal life of faith.
Für jeden, der liest, für mein persönliches Glaubensleben, und das, meine ich, ist etwas
And
ganz
that, I think, is decisive, is the sense that Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, does not minimalize, take away or skip anything from what the Church professes as to faith. And that, for me, is something that remains. I've read the first volume several times. I've read it over and over again in order to accompany certain seasons of my life. I can only recommend it. It's very helpful, a true spiritual nourishment.
Besser gesagt, immer wieder begleitend gelesen zu bestimmten Jahreszeiten. Das kann ich nur empfehlen. Das ist eine große Hilfe, eine geistliche Nahrung.
Das klingt auch danach, dass er selbst aus diesen Überzeugungen heraus.
How did you perceive him? How did he live his faith?
Auch wie hat er seinen Glauben gelebt?
Das Erste ist, er hat den Glauben vermittelt bekommen von seinen Eltern in einer ganz natürlichen.
The faith was transmitted to him by his parents in a very natural, very normal way, and it had a very strong influence on him. What he received from his parents and later from his teachers, his spiritual teachers, was then deepened in his own life, above all through his studies, but also through his lectures. And what he had deepened in such a way became his own life of faith. I always had the impression, and I don't think I'm the only one, that what Professor Ratzinger, Bishop Ratzinger, Archbishop and Cardinal Ratzinger and Pope Benedict said was not something to be recited because it was part of the office. It was, so to speak, flesh of his flesh. It was what he believed and what he wanted to pass on, so that he could pass on this flame to others and make it burn brightly.
Das ist das, was glaubt und das, was weitergeben möchte, und dass diese Flamme auch anderen geben möchte, und möchte, dass es lichterloh brennt.
Aber bleibt einem Papst überhaupt Zeit?
Does a pope have time for prayer, for silence?
Es ist immer eine Frage der Einteilung der Zeit. Wenn mir etwas wichtig ist.
It depends on how you manage your time. If something is important to me, I try to find the necessary time, and not just the time I might have left, but the time that I already schedule for when I plan my day. What I experienced with him as cardinal, but also as pope, after all I lived with him, was that we always had fixed prayer times. There were exceptions, of course, for example, when we were traveling, but prayer times were sacrosanct. In concrete, that meant Holy Mass, breviary, rosary, meditation. There were fixed times, and it was my task to stick to them, and not to say, this is important now, this is very important, and this is even more important. He said the most important thing is that God always comes first. First, we must seek the kingdom of God. Everything else will be given in addition. It's a simple phrase, and it sounds good, but it's not so simple to stick to it. But that's the reason why it's true, and why you must help to ensure that it remains that way.
Nicht einfach, aber deshalb trifft dazu, und deshalb müssen Sie auch mit dafür sorgen, dass das so bleibt.
Heilige sind ja auch Vorbilder für uns.
Saints serve as role models for our Christian life. Who was Pope Benedict's favorite saint?
Der heilige Josef. Ich glaube, das war der Lieblingsheilige, wobei dann relativ schnell Gesellschaft bekommen hat.
His favorite saint was Saint Joseph, but he was soon joined by Saint Augustine and Saint Bonaventure.
Gestalten der Kirche.
And that's simply because he had studied those two great figures of the Church very intensively and could see how they fertilized his spiritual and intellectual life.
Befruchtet haben. Von den Frauen,
Of the women, in order to not mention only men, the Virgin Mary is number one, of course, and then I would say Saint Teresa of Avila, who in her intellectual and spiritual power and strength gave testimony that he found very impressive.
Kraft und Stärke ein Zeugnis abgegeben.
And then, you won't believe it, there's also little Saint Therese of the Child Jesus. Of the more contemporary ones, I believe we can also include Mother Teresa. Thanks to her simplicity and conviction, in fact, what she lived was more than just a lecture on theology. In fundamental theology or whatever subject, she lived the gospel. And that for him was decisive.
Eine Vorlesung in Theologie oder in Fundamentaltheologie oder in welchem Fach auch immer, sondern war das gelebte Evangelium. Und das war für ihn entscheidend und bis zum letzten Tag.
Mutter Teresa hatte ja selbst auch persönlich.
He knew Mother Teresa personally, didn't he?
Yes, he met her in 1978 at the Katholikentag in Freiburg. I happened to be there too. He had just been archbishop for a year, and I'd been in the seminary for a year. Mother Teresa was there in Freiburg's cathedral, and so was the Cardinal of Munich and Freising, Joseph Ratzinger.
Sehr schön. auf einer kirchlichen oder
How did Joseph Ratzinger, how did Pope Benedict shape the church?
Papst Benedikt die Kirche geprägt?
Er hat ja in seiner Predigt beim Beginn des Pontifikats,
As he pointed out in the homily that marked the beginning of his pontificate, when he took up his office, he had no program of governance, no ecclesiastical program. He was merely trying to proclaim God's will, to face the challenges of our time according to God's will. And he wanted to put his whole heart into it. A program wouldn't have been helpful, because back then events moved at an unprecedented speed, even in difficult situations. And to be able to adapt to that was certainly one of his greatest strengths. He was quick in detecting problems, and he knew that they had to be answered with an answer of faith. Not only an answer that had, so to speak, a theological basis, but one that went deeper, stemming from faith itself, being both theologically justified and also convincing. And that's why I think his great contribution, his great support for the believers, was the Word. We've already spoken about the Word being his greatest, his best weapon. How martial that sounds. The Word he could handle, and with the Word he could inspire people and fill their hearts.
Mit dem Wort konnte Menschen begeistern und deren Herzen erfüllen.
Und was waren so die größten
Looking back on his pontificate, what were the greatest challenges he had to face?
Es war ganz klar, ganz am Anfang, die Herausforderung A war das, was mit Relativismus bezeichnet.
It was very clear from the beginning that the greatest challenge was what he called relativism. The Catholic faith and the Catholic Church are convinced that in Jesus Christ, the truth was born and became flesh. I am the way, the truth, and the life.
Dass eben der Relativismus letztlich sagt, das, was ihr wollt, die Wahrheit verkünden, das ist gegen die Toleranz.
And relativism ultimately says, the truth you proclaim is against tolerance. You do not tolerate other convictions. That is, within Christianity, as far as the question of ecumenism is concerned, you do not tolerate other religions. You think little of them.
Ernst nehmen, annehmen. Aber es bedeutet eben nicht, dass ich dann meinen Glauben, von dem ich überzeugt bin,
And that's not true, of course. Tolerance means I can take everyone seriously in his or her faith, in their convictions, and accept them. But it doesn't mean then that I simply devalue my own faith, the faith I'm convinced of, the faith I've received in order to pass it on. Quite the opposite. That was relativism. And then we had the question of the relationship between faith and reason. That was one of his strong points.
Mächtig als Papst. Hatte da als Kardinal ja so seine Erfahrung.
And then when he was Pope, came unexpectedly but very powerfully the whole question of abuse, a challenge that came in such a powerful way one would have never expected. In fact, in this respect, he had already played an important role as cardinal. When the first questions, the first communications, the first difficulties, the first reports of abuse reached us from the USA.
Mitteilungen, die ersten Schwierigkeiten, die ersten Missbrauchsberichte kamen.
At the time, I'd already served in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith for 2 years, so I remember very well how he tackled this. And also how he had to overcome a certain resistance from within. It wasn't easy, but he handled this challenge very well, and in a decisive and courageous manner, which would later have also proven helpful in his pontificate.
Und das andere, das Letzte, wenn ich das sagen darf, meine ich schon, hat immer wieder gesagt,
he always used to say, there are important topics, but the most important one is the faith in God. That is the center around which his preaching, his papacy, and his papal ministry evolved. The conviction that I must proclaim my faith in God. That is essential.
Was war denn das Zentrum, das herum sich seine Verkündigung, sein Papstamt?
Others can do other things, but the main goal, the main task of the Pope is precisely that. And for that testimony, he is and always will be the first witness.
Das ist das Entscheidende. Andere können anderes tun, aber das ist das Hauptziel, die Hauptaufgabe des Papstes, und dafür ist er auch und bleibt er der erste Zeuge.
Das heißt, diese Verkündigung Gottes als
So, the proclamation of God was at the center of his pontificate.
Wenn ich das so komprimieren darf, ja. Die Verkündigung des Glaubens.
Exactly. If I may summarize it like that, the proclamation of the faith, the justification of the gospel. For us, God is not an idea, a mere thought. God is the goal of our faith. In fact, at a certain time, the center of our faith was incarnate, became a man, Jesus of Nazareth. And all we know from that time was then condensed in the Gospels and in the Scriptures, in the New Testament. And to proclaim this, to proclaim it in a credible and convincing way, was the center and the goal of his papal ministry.
Glaubwürdig zu verkünden, überzeugend zu verkünden, das war das Zentrum und das Ziel seines päpstlichen Dienstes.
Vielleicht noch zu den Missbrauchsvorwürfen, Skandalen auch in der Kirche.
Talking about abuse, not long ago, Pope Benedict was mentioned in a report on abuse in the Archdiocese of Munich and Freising. How did he react to these accusations, which were later refuted, but nevertheless brought to his attention? How did that go down with him, especially in the light of all the efforts he made in order to investigate abuse and fight it?
Wenn es Missbrauchsvorwürfe ging.
Wir hatten ja schon kurz vorher angedeutet, dass als Präfekt
We already mentioned how, as a prefect, he had to deal with the accusations coming from the USA at the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, and that he took a strong stance against internal and external resistance.
Als Papst sehr deutlich, sehr klar. Da gibt es genügend konkrete Beispiele.
And the same clear and unambiguous stance was taken when he was Pope. There are plenty of examples of that. When he was then personally accused of mishandling sexual abuse cases during his time as Archbishop of Munich and Freising from 1977 to 1982, it really came as a surprise to him.
Hat sich sehr verwundert. Wurde gefragt, ob bereit ist,
He was asked whether he would agree to answer questions regarding the investigation, which reviewed the management of a succession of archbishops, from Cardinal Faulhaber to the actual archbishop. And he said, "I'm in. I've got nothing to hide." Had he said no, one could have thought he was hiding something. They sent us many questions, and he answered them. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong. He stated everything he could remember. It's all in the report. During the drafting of our statement, we made a little mistake. It was not a mistake on Pope Benedict's part, but an oversight of one of our collaborators, who immediately apologized to him.
Und wie gesagt, es war dann damals, auf unserer Seite ist also bei der Abfassung.
He said that it was his mistake, that he got a date wrong regarding the presence or absence at a meeting. It was immediately published and immediately corrected, but the narrative that the Pope had lied unfortunately remained. And that was the only thing that really shocked him, that he was called a liar. It's simply not true.
Das wurde auch dann sofort publiziert, es wurde auch dann sofort berichtet und
He then wrote a personal letter. He said that this would be the last word on the matter, and that after that letter, he would no longer comment. Who doesn't believe him or doesn't want to believe him doesn't have to do so. But whoever looks at the facts honestly and without bias has to say the accusation of being a liar is simply untrue. And it's infamous. It was an accusation that really shocked him, especially since it came from a side that doesn't exactly stand out for doing great things in the moral sphere, but quite the opposite. It was so moralizing that one has to say it is and remains shameful. But that wasn't the last word. Pope Benedict said, "I didn't hide anything. I said what I have to say. I have nothing more to add. There's nothing more to say."
Nicht wahr und ist infam.
He could only appeal to reason, goodwill, and honesty. There was really not much else to do. And that's exactly what he wrote in his letter. For everything else, he would have to answer to the good Lord.
Das andere, das hat ja auch in seinem Brief geschrieben, das andere wird der liebe Gott dann schon mit ihm selber ausmachen.
Und das, was Sie sagen, ist ja auch nachvollziehbar, nicht in den Dokumenten und Akten. Also
in fact, what you say is all there, in the documents and in the files. Anyone who acts without malicious intent can reconstruct it and bring the truth to light.
Es ist genau so, wie gesagt, die Unvoreingenommenheit ist eine Voraussetzung.
As I said, impartiality is a prerequisite, not only in this case, but in principle, but especially in this case. And who's willing to act with impartiality has recognized that or will recognize that.
War Papst Benedikt eigentlich glücklich? Haben Sie ihn so wahrgenommen als jemand, der...
Was Pope Benedict happy? Was he satisfied, fulfilled in his personal journey through life?
Von den von Ihnen jetzt genannten Adjektiven würde ich sagen, das letzte trifft zu, nämlich die Erfüllung.
Of all the adjectives you just mentioned, I would say the last one is true, fulfillment. I perceived him as someone who was really fulfilled by what he was doing. He decided to dedicate his life to the priesthood. His first vocation, his first love, was teaching, of course, and that's why he became a professor. It was simply his
Die
destiny.
Lehre, ist ein Professor geworden, das war einfach seine Bestimmung. Und dann musste
And then he
Bischof
became a
werden.
bishop, and finally he came to Rome. It was all in line with his nature, his intellectual structure.
Dann kam nach Rom, das war
That he
dann
became
auch
pope
eher
was,
gewesen
as
von
I
der
already
ganzen
said, the last
Art
thing he
und
ever
seiner
expected or wanted.
Struktur her.
But he accepted it, and in all his tasks, as far as I could see, he was really fulfilled and prepared to give everything.
Aufgaben angenommen. Und in all diesen Aufgaben, soweit ich das sehen konnte und
I
erkennen
noticed that he gave something of himself. He gave what was most important to him. What he was passing on wasn't something that he had picked up somewhere sometime. He was passing on something of himself, something that came from his own life, his intellectual honesty, his faith, going back to the image of the spark in order to make it sprinkle and spark a fire.
gestellt war weiter, damit, um nochmal das Bild des Funkens zu gebrauchen, damit der Funke einfach sprüht und das dann Feuer entfacht wird.
Gab es für ihn überhaupt Zeit und seine
Did he have time to think about his family of origin? Was there still a connection? How did he talk about his family?
Bei all dem, was man lesen kann, bei all dem, was gesagt hat, was ich selber auch
Considering all the things you can read, all the things he said and which I heard myself, I have to say he only spoke really lovingly and with great respect about what his parents did, especially for their 3 children. His father was a police officer. They didn't have much money,
großer Geldfluss.
and yet all the children had a very good education, and that was expensive. But what was really decisive was the example of faith they gave them. He always said that this was and remained the basis for everything that came later.
Die Grundlage für all das, was später gekommen ist, gewesen ist und bleibt.
Welche Worte werden Sie mitnehmen?
Which of the words he said will you remember? What will remain?
Also, da darf ich jetzt mal ein bisschen aus dem Nähkästchen plaudern.
Well, at this point, let me just spill the beans. Time and again, especially during his time as emeritus, I found myself in difficult situations, moments when I said, Holy Father, this cannot be. I cannot cope with it. The church is running against a brick wall. I don't know. Is the Lord asleep? Is he not there? What's going on? And he said, You know the gospel a little, don't you? The Lord was asleep in the boat on the Sea of Galilee, so the story goes. The disciples were afraid, a storm was coming, waves were coming. And they woke him up because they didn't know what to do. And he just said, What's going on? Jesus only had to speak a few words to the storm in order to make it clear that he is the Lord, even over the weather and the storms. And then Pope Benedict said to me, Look, the Lord doesn't sleep.
Da hat er nur gesagt, ja, was ist denn los? Ne? Also, hat 2, 3 Worte an das Unwerte gerichtet.
So if, even in his presence, the disciples were afraid, it's quite normal that the disciples of today can be afraid here and there. But never forget one thing. He is here, and he remains here.
Schauen Sie, der Herr schläft nicht. Der Herr ist da, dass, wenn Jünger Angst hatten in seiner Gegenwart, auch die Jünger von heute da und dort Angst haben, ist ganz normal. Aber vergessen
In
Sie
all
eins,
that's troubling you now, that's difficult for you now, that weighs on your heart or on your stomach, that is something you must never forget. Take that from me. I act accordingly. That's something that, among other things, has really sunk into my heart, and it remains firmly anchored there.
Das ist das, was unter anderem, aber das ist das, was mir richtig ins Herz hineingefallen ist und dort also schön verankert bleibt.
Vielleicht noch eine andere
Can you share another anecdote from your time with Pope Benedict?
Ja, Papst Benedikt ist ja ein Mann gewesen mit einem sehr feinen Humor. Er mochte es, wenn auch in einer schwierigen Frage der Humor nicht total.
Pope Benedict was a man with a fine sense of humor. He liked it when, even in difficult questions, humor was not totally shelved, since it can provide a sort of grounding, but also a sort of wire that leads us upwards.
Zeichnet. So habe ich da und dort immer wieder gemerkt, wie er.
Thus, I could notice here and there how in difficult situations, be it as a cardinal or as pope, he tried not to bring about some sort of funny turn that sounds too superficial, but to bring in an ounce of humor, an element of humor that could detoxify things. And that has proven very precious for my own life in some difficult situations, and I'm very grateful for that.
Das hat mir für mein eigenes Leben, auch für manche schwierige Situation viel gegeben, wofür ich sehr dankbar bin.
Santo
Santo
subito.
subito, saint right away.
So war zu lesen bei der Beerdigung von Johannes Paul II.
That was the message we could read at the funeral of John Paul II in St. Peter's Square. I remember it all too well. There were many signs and also large painted posters with the caption, Santo subito.
Bemalte Plakate, Santo subito. Ich glaube,
I believe it will go in this direction.
gehen wird.
Exzellenz, herzlichen Dank für das Gespräch.
Excellency, thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you for having me.